James Bulger was a bright and lively toddler who lived with his family on the quiet outskirts of Chicago, Illinois, in the early 1990s. Nestled in a close-knit suburban neighborhood, James was cherished by his parents and those who knew him, admired for his playful innocence and ever-present curiosity about the world around him. With his round cheeks, big blue eyes and infectious laughter, James easily captured the hearts of his neighbors, quickly becoming a familiar and beloved presence in the local parks and playgrounds. His parents often described James as an adventurous spirit, eager to explore the world beyond their cozy home. Whether he was toddling across the freshly mowed lawns, chasing after butterflies, or giggling at the sight of friendly pets, James left a trail of joy wherever he went. Family photographs showed him always clinging to a favorite teddy bear, or nestled safely in his mother's arms, his tiny hands grasping at new experiences. He loved building block towers and listening to bedtime stories before falling asleep to the soft lullabies sung by his parents. James's daily life reflected the simplicity and warmth of a loving American family. Weekends were spent visiting bustling neighborhood markets or delighting in ice cream treats at the corner shop. Special occasions meant trips to the city where James's eyes would light up at the colorful displays in shop windows and the hustle and bustle of urban life just a few miles from the quiet comfort of home. For all who knew him, James symbolized the innocence and hope found in every young child, a precious life just beginning to blossom in the embrace of family and community. At barely 2 years old in February of 1993, James was at an age when most children are just beginning to piece together their first words, making their first wobbly steps around the house, and discovering the small wonders of the world with unabashed curiosity. It was in this fragile, innocent phase of life, when he should have been nurtured and fiercely protected, that James became the victim of a crime so shocking, so unimaginable, that it reverberated across the entire nation. The tragic incident which claimed the life of such a young child did not just bring grief to his immediate family, but sent powerful waves of sorrow and disbelief throughout American society. Parents everywhere found themselves holding their children a little tighter, acutely aware of how quickly the ordinary rhythms of daily life could be shattered. News outlets recounted the story with a rare mix of outrage and heartbreak, turning James's name into a somber symbol of innocence lost. Community leaders, law enforcement and child advocates joined together in mourning, grappling with the haunting question of how such a devastating event could strike the very youngest and most defenseless among them. On that seemingly ordinary day, James's mother decided to take her son on a routine trip to one of the bustling shopping centers located on the outskirts of Chicago. The mall was alive with the familiar sights and sounds of suburban life. Fluorescent lights overhead, the echo of conversations, families shuffling past store windows decorated with vibrant displays, and the tempting aroma wafting from food court vendors. For James and his mother, these outings were always something of a small adventure, a break from the routine, a chance to marvel at the world beyond their own neighborhood. James's mother, like so many devoted parents, juggled watchfulness with the daily tasks of shopping, occasionally glancing down to see her little boy peering wide-eyed at toy displays, or toddling a few steps ahead with innocent excitement. She may have paused to run her hand over a rack of children's clothes, or to double-check a grocery list tucked into her bag, never imagining the unimaginable. That in a brief, vulnerable moment, something could happen that would alter both of their lives forever. The mall offered a sense of community and safety, a place where families gathered and children's laughter mingled with the hum of commerce, making what followed that afternoon all the more unthinkable. While James's mother was briefly distracted, perhaps only for a matter of seconds, two unfamiliar boys, later identified as Robert Thompson and John Venables, began to close in on the unsuspecting toddler. Both boys were just 10 years old, students in the local public school system, and, at first glance, they appeared to be ordinary children wandering through the shopping center like so many others. There was nothing about their appearance or behavior in those initial moments to suggest the darkness of their intentions. They observed James with a careful, calculated curiosity, staying close as he lingered by colorful displays and effortlessly blending in with the lively crowd. The pair quietly assessed the best opportunity, waiting for James's mother to be distracted by a conversation or momentarily preoccupied with a purchase. Moving with a subtle confidence rarely seen in children so young, Robert and John approached James, reaching out a hand or saying something soft and inviting that caught his attention. Perhaps James, with the trusting innocence of someone so small, felt no fear in the presence of older kids. To onlookers, it might have seemed as if the two boys were merely helping a lost child or offering to play. The truth, however, was far more sinister. In the fleeting, vulnerable moment when a parent's eyes are elsewhere, tragedy began to unfold, setting in motion a chain of events that would devastate a family and forever change a community's sense of safety. Robert and John, both just 10 years old, began to lead little James away from the bustling shopping center, steering him out of the safety of the crowd and into the intricate maze of city streets. At first, their journey was unremarkable, passing through the main entrance amid families doing their weekend shopping, blending into the merry shuffle of shoes and laughter. But with each careful step, their course took James further from familiar sights, threading him into unfamiliar territory and a darker world he could not possibly understand. As the trio made their way through the outer parking lots, the concrete and asphalt melted into quieter side streets. Surrounding traffic thinned and store windows gave way to rows of modest homes with picket fences and overgrown gardens. Robert and John walked quickly, their small hands holding onto James just tight enough to keep him moving, yet gentle enough to avoid drawing attention. James, trusting and curious, looked up at his new companions and occasionally at the changing scenery, his 2-year-old mind unable to grasp the gravity of his situation. Now, outside the protective sphere of the mall, the morning sun dimmed behind passing clouds, and a chill crept into the air, a subtle reflection of the shifting mood. Few pedestrians occupied the streets that day. Those who saw the boys, if they noticed at all, might have presumed they were siblings or friends out for a stroll. Robert and John whispered to each other, sometimes glancing behind them. They kept their tone light for James, perhaps pointing out stray cats or dogs, or telling him about the places they passed, details to keep him from getting upset or frightened. Children his age often relied on the warmth of older kids to guide them, and he was no exception. His tiny footsteps hurried to keep up as they turned onto quieter roads, their pace quickening over time, shifting further from the world he knew. The city transformed as they walked. Apartment blocks began to loom overhead, casting long shadows on crumbling sidewalks spotted with weeds. Vacant lots and boarded-up storefronts punctuated the journey, their windows caked in dust and old flyers. The distant rumble of cars softened, replaced by the occasional bark of a dog or the flutter of pigeons startled by their passage. Every so often a resident gazed out from a porch, puzzled by the sight of 2 bigger boys holding hands with a much smaller child, but none paused long enough to question. Robert and John navigated alleyways littered with debris, abandoned shopping carts, discarded wrappers, broken toys, spaces where only the bravest children dared play. They crossed over cracked pavements and beneath graffiti-smeared brick walls. James, stumbling at times, was coaxed onward with promises or reassurances. The city's rhythm slowed around them, folding James into its hidden corners. Their journey took them past empty playgrounds where metal swings creaked in the wind, memories of laughter fading into a heavy silence. The innocence of colored slides and painted jungle gyms stood in stark contrast to the gravity of what was unfolding. At intervals, James showed the confusion and fatigue natural for a boy his age. He sometimes whimpered or pulled back. In response, Robert and John alternated tactics, sometimes comforting, sometimes stern. They would urge him along when he hesitated at unfamiliar intersections, quietly hushing any sign of distress. A few people glanced their way, a cyclist speeding by, a store clerk sweeping the front step, a mother with a toddler in hand crossing to the opposite side of the street. Some briefly hesitated, drawn to the odd trio, but the errand of daily life proved stronger than their curiosity or concern. As they ventured farther, the boys took James through tunnels under highways and along overpasses, where the distant hum of traffic and the harsh clatter of passing trains added to the growing sense of unease. The cityscape grew rougher, with derelict warehouses rising like silent sentinels, fences topped with barbed wire, puddles reflecting gray skies, and a chill wind that sent leaves scuttling down the gutter, all set a somber theater. Meanwhile, unease flickered in the hearts of Robert and John. Their voices grew softer, their movements more cautious. The gravity of their decision weighed on them, though neither dared to turn back. For James, every step stripped away another layer of normalcy, the familiar rhythm of his life replaced by uncertainty. Sometimes he would pause, gazing back the way they came, his innocent face momentarily unsettled. Yet each time he was pulled forward, onward into the city's labyrinth. Crossing over weathered pedestrian bridges spanning small creeks, they found themselves walking parallel to train tracks cutting through the outskirts. Suburban houses now gave way to industrial backroads. Old warehouses with rusting doors, piles of forgotten lumber, and long stretches of gravel lined by wild grass. The industrial hum of the city faded behind them, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the distant echo of a train's whistle. The boys' voices echoed differently here, hushed and restrained. One of the boys pointed out a graffiti drawing on a concrete wall, perhaps in a last attempt to entertain or distract James, who now showed clear signs of exhaustion. His stride had slowed and he began asking for his mother. The other boys, nervous and determined, grew impatient with his reluctance, increasing their pace and quietly coaxing him along with less and less patience. They passed under overpasses where the shadows stretched and deepened, creating pools of dim light that seemed to swallow their small forms. At each juncture the road split in new directions, and with every choice they moved farther into isolation. Abandoned vehicles, old shopping carts, and piles of construction debris became frequent sights. One building, its windows shattered and its brickwork stained, seemed to watch them as they passed, its emptiness mirroring the absence of adult protection for James. The group skirted around vacant fields, braving muddy patches and discarded bottles, until the last vestiges of suburbia faded behind them. Here, fences sagged under the weight of rust, and graffiti tags spelled out forgotten names. Wild shrubs grew through gaps in cracked concrete, and the remains of a rusted slide tilted in the grass. James's questions subsided, replaced by silence and the uncertain trust that only the youngest children grant their elders. Through it all, Robert and John exchanged nervous glances, more aware with each passing minute of the gravity of where this journey would end. Finally, the trio crossed the boundary into a remote part of the city, a forgotten stretch near the train tracks, where no one came except to pass hurriedly through or to hide from the world. Here, the city surrendered to the slow encroachment of nature and neglect. The steel rails shimmered in the cold afternoon air, weaving a final cruel path that would forever haunt those who came to know what happened next. Little James, still holding the hand of a boy twice his age, had followed his unwitting guides on a silent odyssey through the city, each new street another door closing behind him, each step further into shadow. When the trio finally arrived at the desolate, out-of-the-way area near the railway tracks, the atmosphere changed dramatically. An anxious silence had begun to settle, broken only by the distant rumble of passing trains and the dull clang of metal on gravel. The sky had darkened, casting muted shadows across the uneven ground, as if the world itself sensed something terrible was about to unfold. Here, away from the watchful eyes of the community, Robert and John's demeanor shifted. Gone was the feigned friendliness or awkward camaraderie they had displayed in the streets. Now, their actions took on a chilling purposefulness that would forever haunt all who would later learn of their crime. James, exhausted and bewildered after being led through such an unfamiliar urban labyrinth, likely felt a creeping fear take hold. He was small, far too small to defend himself, his earlier trust now replaced by confusion and distress. Robert and John, driven by a frightening and inexplicable impulse, began to menace the tiny boy. They taunted and poked at him at first, perhaps testing his reactions, pushing boundaries that children that age would rarely, if ever, consider crossing. The only witnesses were the wind rattling through cracked windows and the occasional crow perched atop rusty fences. The brutality escalated quickly. John first grabbed a brick from among the scattered debris and, after exchanging hushed words with Robert, used it to threaten and then strike James. Each blow seemed to strip away another layer of innocence, not just from James, but from the world itself. When James stumbled and whimpered, the older boys did not stop. Instead they continued, kicking him, punching him, using anything within reach to inflict pain. The assault, horrifying in its duration and violence, defied comprehension. Their small hands became instruments of cruelty, delivering injuries far beyond what anyone could imagine from children so young. As the violence continued, James's cries echoed across the empty lots and faded into the tracks, unheard by any adult who might have intervened. The two assailants, perhaps emboldened by each other's presence, seemed temporarily detached from the enormity of what they were doing. They struck James with sticks, pelted him with stones, and dragged him across the gravel. It was a scene that embodied not only physical violence but also the uncanny ability of children to mimic cruelty when left unchecked. Throughout the assault, neither Robert nor John appeared to show the kind of empathy or restraint that one might expect, even from children. Their faces reportedly displayed an unsettling mix of anticipation and nervousness, revealing the twisted nature of their brief alliance. James, though hurt and terrified, struggled in vain to protect himself or crawl away. His sobs faded to soft whimpers as exhaustion and pain overwhelmed him. The innocence that had defined his life until then, the joy, curiosity, and trust, was cruelly snuffed out in that cold, deserted place. Moments that should have been filled with laughter and discovery were replaced by trauma and irreversible harm, inflicted without mercy. The surroundings served only to emphasize the horror. The abandoned landscape seemed to close in, offering shelter not to those in need, but to unspeakable acts. Pieces of broken glass glittered on the ground like cynical stars. An old tire swing creaked in the wind, recalling the playgrounds on which James had so recently played. The sharp scent of oil mingled with the earthy odor of damp soil, and somewhere, water dripped steadily onto cold rock. All these details would later haunt the memories of investigators, and, by extension, anyone who read about the case. During the attack, the boys found a heavy metal bar, one of the rails used for the nearby tracks. Together they used it, lifting it and bringing it down on the already injured child. The force of the blow was devastating, the act itself almost unimaginable. The abandoned rails, which for decades had merely served the passage of trains, now became unwilling tools in a moment of monstrous violence. The physical injuries far exceeded what anyone could picture possible coming from children, amplifying both the tragedy and the chilling sense of lost innocence. Still, there was no one to intervene, no adult footsteps to bring the chaos to a halt. Somewhere in the midst of this violence, the boys may have hesitated. In later reports and confessions, each would shift blame or claim that the other played a bigger role, perhaps aware on some deep level of the unspeakable horror they had committed. But for James there was no mercy, no rescue. The attack had been sustained and systematic, carried out with a confusion and cruelty that defied everything society hoped to believe about the innocence of childhood. With the final blow, the terrible silence that followed was broken only by the far-off sound of a train, indifferent, unknowing, rolling through a city that had just lost one of its youngest souls to an unimaginable act of violence. For a long time after, that patch of ground would bear the scar of what happened there. Passers-by, on the rare occasion anyone returned, reported a chilling stillness, as if the land itself had been marked. For investigators and the families, it became a place not just of crime, but of shattered illusions about safety, innocence, and the nature of evil itself. At the very heart of the tragedy, a moment so horrifying that it would echo for decades, was when Robert and John's cruelty reached its absolute peak. They found a heavy steel bar, a piece of railway track that had lain unused and rusted near the forgotten embankment. The physical surroundings seemed to hold their breath, the abandoned rails and crumbling cement witnesses to the unthinkable. The sky hung low and gray, as if it too recoiled from what was about to happen. Until that point, the violence had been brutal, yet not final. Blows, kicks, and taunts, all meant to exhaust, scare, and dominate James. The discovery of the steel bar changed everything. For a child, to even lift such an object was an act that crossed any recognizable boundary between mischief and wickedness. Yet, emboldened by adrenaline and perhaps by one another's presence, the boys hoisted the bar together. There was an eerie deliberation in their movements. Hesitation at first, as if even they, in their young minds, knew the magnitude of what they were about to do. Their small hands slipped over the cold, rough metal, streaked with rust and grime, the bar so much larger than anything children should ever handle. James, battered and stunned, barely conscious and utterly alone, looked up from the gravel-strewn ground, confusion and terror written on his face. His breaths were shallow, interrupted by faint whimpers, eyes darting between his assailants and the overcast sky that offered neither comfort nor hope. The children's voices were now hushed, the childish bravado replaced by a chilling focus. John glanced at Robert, searching for reassurance, while Robert's jaw clenched with a mixture of uncertainty and grim determination. As they approached James with the steel bar, the noises around them seemed to fade to nothing. No birds, no distant traffic, just the sound of labored breathing and the metallic scrape of the bar across crushed pebbles. The bar felt impossibly heavy, a weapon that belonged to a world of adult power and danger, not in the hands of children. Taking turns, they brought it down upon James, each blow a choice, each strike influenced by some unknowable calculation. To the outside world, this act would be almost impossible to fathom. How could children, mere children, cross such a line? The question would haunt everyone who learned the details for years to come. With the first impact, a sickening finality filled the air. the sound of metal meeting bone, the sharp intake of breath from James, and the sudden silence that followed seemed to freeze the moment in time. For James there was no time left for understanding or fear, only the cold, crushing pain, and the world slipping away beneath a darkening sky. The violence was quick, methodical, and so deeply wrong that the space itself appeared to recoil. The long grasses around the track seemed to bend away, as if shivering at the scene they were forced to witness. The ground, already stained by the passage of countless freight cars, now bore another, more permanent scar. It is impossible to know exactly what ran through Robert and John's minds in the moments that followed. Perhaps a sudden and terrible awareness of what they had done. Perhaps nothing at all, a numb, empty shock. They stood over James's now motionless body, breathless, their hearts hammering in their chests. The steel bar lay discarded, its purpose spent, a relic of violence that should never have taken place. For a moment the only sound was the distant clatter of a train passing on another set of tracks, oblivious, indifferent. The boys' faces reportedly changed in an instant, no longer cocky or mischievous but hollowed by the weight of their irreversible actions. John wiped his brow with the sleeve of his coat, eyes darting from the lifeless form of James to Robert, seeking any hint of reassurance that everything might yet go back to normal. Robert's hands shook, he tried to smooth his hair as if tidying up might somehow erase what had happened. But there was no undoing the act. Even the environment seemed changed. The wind whistled through the skeletons of old railcars, stilled trash rustled in the grass, and the silence pressed in with a terrible finality. The brutal use of the steel bar would later become the defining detail of this crime, a symbol of how far from innocence things had spiraled. It was an act so deliberate and forceful, authorities who later reconstructed the scene struggled to comprehend how boys so young could inflict such violence. The medical examiner would find injuries so severe that, for a time, even the mechanics of what had happened remained unclear. News outlets and experts alike would debate whether the full truth of the moment could even be understood by adult minds, much less those of the children involved. Robert and John's actions in the aftermath were marked by a dazed sort of urgency. They cleaned their hands on their pants, scuffed at the dirt as if trying to erase their footprints. In hurried whispers they discussed what to do next, fear and guilt fighting for control. Eventually they would attempt to conceal James's body by placing it on the rails, hoping a passing train would mask the evidence of their involvement. But the marks left by the steel bar, the injuries, the trauma, the sheer horror, could never be obscured so easily. For investigators and for the world at large, the use of the railway bar became the line no one wanted to imagine children crossing. In the years that followed, those working the case would report nightmares of a small hand gripping cold metal, the echo of a violent act reverberating through their sleep. Psychologists, criminologists, and communities would return again and again to that singular moment, seeking answers in the why and the how, but always coming back to the chilling impossibility of it all. Some would say evil visited that lonely stretch of track that day, others would search for meaning in the histories of the boys or the failings of the adult world around them. But the reality, cold, simple, and devastating, was this. With the steel rail in hand, innocence was shattered, a life was ended, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. After the senseless violence at the desolate rail yard, Robert and John did not immediately flee the scene in panic. Instead, in those haunting moments afterward, their actions reflected a strange blend of childish confusion, fear, desperation, and a chilling, almost clinical, calculation. Standing over the motionless, broken form of little James, the two boys were gripped by anxiety and dread, but also a naive, if disturbing, logic. They wanted to conceal what they had done and somehow make it all go away. The afternoon air seemed to press down on them as they considered their next steps. They glanced at each other, their faces smeared with dirt and fear, sharing hurried, hushed conversations interrupted by nervous glances over their shoulders. Every sound, a distant horn, the scuffling of their own feet, the rustle of weeds swaying in the wind, made them jump. Their breath mingled in cold clouds as they tried not to look at what they had left behind. John, his hands trembling, suggested they try to move James's body close to the railroad tracks. Robert nodded, biting his lip and wringing his hands as if hoping all evidence of their brutality would simply vanish. Working together, their young arms strained as they heaved and dragged the small body, ignoring the new marks they left in the dirt and gravel. The effort brought a sickening mix of physical exhaustion and horror, an awareness that what they were doing was deeply wrong, but neither voiced it. When they reached the edge of the tracks, an almost paralyzing realization set in. They couldn't fully process the magnitude of their actions, but they knew, through a mixture of fear and the scraps of knowledge gleaned from television or overheard adult conversations, that what had happened must be hidden, or they would be caught and punished. So, they spent several uneasy minutes positioning James's body directly across one set of rails. These were acts carried out in clumsy silence, punctuated by shouts to hurry and wild, darting eyes scanning for any sign of interruption. Trying to further disguise the crime, they arranged a few small stones and bricks near the body, hoping foolishly that these could confuse any investigation or at least delay the discovery. Occasionally one would stop and look back at the shadowy corners or the distant city skyline, heart hammering, as if expecting an angry adult or police officer to step out of the gloom. Their childish attempts at covering their tracks only made the sight seem more chaotic, a haphazard scattering of objects among the weeds and broken glass. In those moments, the overwhelming need to escape began to take over. Both boys wiped their hands on their clothes in an unconscious attempt to erase all evidence of their actions. For a brief instant John wanted to cry, but instead he clenched his jaw, blinking furiously and muttering about going home before anyone noticed their absence. Robert, meanwhile, paced back and forth, eyes wide, face pale beneath streaks of grime and sweat. He looked like he was trying to wake from a nightmare but couldn't. Before leaving, the boys made one last check to see if anyone had seen them. The emptiness of the rail yard was at once comforting and terrifying. There were no witnesses, but the silence amplified their shame. They hurriedly left the scene, stumbling across weeds and track ballast, glancing back one last time at the place where innocence and life had so brutally ended. As they re-entered the city, their demeanor shifted again. Now, instead of the calculated movements they displayed while attempting to cover up the crime, they attempted to blend in, to appear as if nothing had happened. They split up near familiar streets, silently agreeing not to say a word about what had transpired. Their walks home were awkward and hurried. Both boys were on edge with every passing adult, every barking dog, every creak of a backyard fence. Within their homes, the enormity of what they had done chased them into their rooms. Robert refused to meet his parents' eyes, claiming he was tired or felt unwell. John washed his hands over and over, scrubbing with soap as if the violence could be erased from his skin. Both tossed in their beds that night, dreams plagued by horrific echoes of what they'd done, jolting awake with shudders at each imaginary siren. Meanwhile, the question of whether their crude attempt to stage an accident would succeed hovered over them. They knew only what they had pieced together from snippets of conversation and their own childlike understanding of death, that a body on the railroad tracks might just be mistaken for a tragic mishap. What neither grasped was how quickly adults, especially law enforcement, could sense when something was terribly wrong. Over the hours and days that followed, John and Robert stuck to their fragile pact of silence. Each time they made eye contact at school or in the neighborhood, there was a heavy, unspoken tension, a shared secret that now defined their young lives. In whispered conversations and shifty glances, they tried to reassure each other that no one would find out. But the cracks in their resolve grew wider with each passing day. Their actions after the crime revealed as much about the boys' terror and fractured innocence as the crime itself. These were not the careful calculations of seasoned criminals, but the desperate stumbling improvisations of children suddenly and utterly in over their heads. Their effort to stage an accident was, in retrospect, not only doomed to failure, but childishly incomplete. Police investigators would soon uncover obvious traces of their involvement: handprints, footprints, the telltale arrangement of debris, and the lingering question of why such a young victim had been left in such a condition in such a place. The impact of John and Robert's post-crime actions rippled out well beyond the rail yard itself. Investigators were immediately struck by the strangeness of the scene, not only the brutality of the murder but also the hasty, almost panicked attempt to mask it as an accident. The discovery fed into public bewilderment and fear, prompting experts across the nation to wonder what kind of circumstances, environment, or internal turmoil could push two children to such a point. For Robert and John, their lives would never return to normal. Their failed attempts at normalcy, returning home, keeping up appearances, holding their secrets close, only deepened their isolation. The heavy burden of guilt, mingled with fear of discovery, would eventually wear down any hope of hiding what they had done. In the end, everything they tried to cover up would emerge in the harsh light of investigation, leaving behind a trail of damage that would stretch far beyond that one empty rail yard. After the horrific incident and the chilling attempts by Robert and John to hastily cover their tracks, the city of Chicago, accustomed to bustling life yet always vigilant, was suddenly thrust into one of its darkest investigative journeys. The disappearance of little James Bulger sent ripples of fear and disbelief through the neighborhood. His family, frantic and heartbroken, immediately alerted local authorities, setting off a citywide manhunt that would soon expose the chilling truth hidden beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary suburban afternoon. From the outset, detectives sensed that something was awry. The spot where James's body was found, near the lonely railroad tracks shrouded by overgrown weeds and scattered debris, was anything but typical for an accident. Seasoned officers from the Chicago Police Department, some with decades of experience dealing with the city's most serious crimes, arrived at the scene. Instinctively, they knew this would require a careful, methodical approach. They cordoned off the rail yard, securing evidence and photographing every detail, from the arrangement of the body to the peculiar scattering of objects around it. It didn't take long before alarm bells began to ring. The manner in which James's body was positioned, deliberately laid across the tracks with bruises and injuries that went beyond what anyone might expect from a mere train accident, immediately raised suspicions. Detectives noted marks inconsistent with the impact from a passing train. Instead, there were clear signs of blunt force trauma, as well as smaller abrasions, scratches and bruises that painted a picture of deliberate, sustained violence rather than a single tragic misstep. A forensic team combed the site, collecting everything from stray fibers caught in the weeds to fingerprints on the nearby bricks and pieces of the rail. They discovered smeared handprints, disturbed gravel, and footprints that, when measured, seemed smaller than those left by adults. Investigators took casts of these prints and began the painstaking task of matching them to local residents, including searching for children who might have been missing or out of place that day. One key clue came from a small toy found not far from the scene, James's beloved teddy bear. Its fur was matted with dirt, but it led officers to believe he wasn't alone in his final moments, and that he may have been lured rather than simply lost. Eyewitness interviews began in earnest. Detectives canvassed nearby apartments, shops, and bus stops, speaking to anyone who might have seen an unaccompanied child or noticed anything odd during the day of the tragedy. Crucially, a store clerk remembered seeing two older boys, looking uneasy and glancing repeatedly over their shoulders, accompanying a much younger child through the streets near the shopping center shortly before the estimated time of James's disappearance. Their descriptions, paired with the partial images caught by grainy security cameras in the mall, gave investigators something vital: leads to pursue, faces to identify, and above all, a timeline. Detectives pored over hours of surveillance footage. In scenes sometimes blurred or fragmented by flickering lights and the low-quality technology of the era, they caught glimpses of two boys, clearly older than a toddler, but not yet teenagers, in close proximity to James. The trio could be seen passing through the busy corridors of the shopping center and later exiting toward the less crowded entrances. This evidence, while not conclusive by itself, began to shift the focus away from the theory of an accidental death or simple abduction. Meanwhile, medical examiners worked meticulously to determine the specifics of James's injuries. Their detailed report contradicted the scenario of an accident entirely. The variety, severity, and locations of the wounds, particularly those made by blunt objects and disturbingly a heavy piece of rail, could only point to intentional harm. Patterns on James's clothes and exposed skin told a silent story, one that spoke more to malice than to mishap. Law enforcement shared the findings with child advocacy experts and psychologists, who confirmed just how rare and significant such evidence of deliberate violence by children truly was. Alongside the forensics and medical evidence, officers pressed on with canvassing the community. Parents, teachers, and local kids were questioned, subtly but firmly, about anything unusual they'd seen. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was tense. Fear mingled with anger, and suspicion began to settle over streets that just days before had felt safe. Rumors swirled, but hard facts were emerging, and the pieces began to fit together. The turning point came when investigators tracked down a school janitor who, on the day James vanished, had noticed two boys washing their hands and clothes in the restroom, hands and shoes caked with what looked like mud, but tinged with something darker. The boys had acted jumpy, avoiding eye contact, and left behind a pair of socks that tested positive for blood residue. This tip, reported to the police by the conscientious janitor, helped narrow the list of possible suspects and fan out surveillance across local schools and playgrounds. Detectives soon called in more children for gentle but pointed questioning. Through interviews, whispers, and the nervousness of young suspects, a chilling truth began to emerge. The community's sense of disbelief was slowly replaced by a grim, heart-wrenching certainty. The perpetrators were not faceless monsters from afar, but two boys from within the very fabric of their own society. With mounting evidence and growing certainty, authorities approached the families of Robert and John. Both initially denied any involvement, but inconsistencies in their alibis quickly unraveled. When confronted with surveillance images and the physical evidence, particularly the matched shoe prints, blood traces on their clothing, and the testimony from peers and adults, both boys ultimately broke down and confessed, though each tried to minimize their own role while blaming the other. This confession, corroborated with forensic and circumstantial proofs, shattered any remaining illusion of that day's tragedy being accidental. The city, already in mourning, was forced to reckon with the reality that such violence could spring from the hands of children. For the police, the investigation stood out as a testament to the painstaking diligence required in cases so outside the norm. Every officer, investigator, and expert involved carried away the heavy knowledge that their swift but thorough work had cut through uncertainty, exposed the truth, and, above all, ensured that James Bulger's final hours would not be simply hidden under the silence of a railroad track. From the moment the news broke, the story of the tragic murder sent shockwaves throughout not only Chicago but the entire United States. Journalists and television crews rushed to the scene and to the Bulger family's quiet neighborhood, desperate to understand how something so harrowing could have transpired in their own backyard. Newspapers ran bold headlines describing it as one of the most brutal and chilling crimes in recent memory, and the details of what happened flooded the airwaves. Nightly news anchors with somber gravitas recounted the macabre sequence of events, emphasizing both the vulnerability of the victim and the deeply disturbing age of his assailants. The American media landscape soon became saturated with coverage. Every major network, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, dedicated entire segments, piecing together the timeline, illustrating the innocent morning in the mall morphing into an unimaginable ordeal. Front pages carried images of James's round-cheeked, smiling face alongside stark photos of the bleak rail yard and the young perpetrators. The dichotomy was stark. A child representing hope and innocence, juxtaposed painfully against the expressions of his child attackers. Talk shows and radio programs erupted with public outrage and debate. Callers shared their grief, anger, and incredulity at the nature of the crime. Some hosts invited experts, criminologists, psychologists, social workers, to probe at the question tormenting the nation. How could children as young as 10 commit such an atrocity? Feature articles and long-form reports delved into every detail of the investigation and the backgrounds of the boys involved. The media scrutinized not only the conditions that had led to such a horrific event, but also the larger societal and familial issues that might play a role. Debates raged on whether something in the culture could have bred such violence and what might be done to prevent it. There was extensive analysis of criminal justice policies for minors, the potential influence of violent media, and even the dynamics in classrooms and playgrounds. In an attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible, reporters interviewed everyone connected to the case: the police detectives whose composure seemed frayed at the edges, teachers struggling to reconcile their memories of the boys with what they had done, and neighbors racked by guilt for not recognizing any warning signs. The community's response was laid bare for the world to see, and many parents admitted to clinging tighter to their children, suddenly suspicious of everyone, even those close by. The ferociousness of the crime's depiction in the press was matched only by the depth of the public conversation it unleashed. Editorials decried not only the act itself, but the apparent breakdowns in social safety nets, and the responsibilities of adults to protect children. Some outlets cautioned against demonizing an entire generation over the actions of two, but a great deal of coverage focused on the loss of innocence, the notion that something in the social fabric had been irreparably torn. Televised court proceedings became a national spectacle. News channels interrupted regular programming to provide minute-by-minute updates from the courthouse steps. Legal analysts explained the unprecedented nature of prosecuting children for such grave crimes, and cameras panned the tense faces of the families involved. The haunting 911 calls, the prosecution's graphic descriptions, and even diagrams of the crime scene became part of the mainstay narrative. There was, too, a persistent search for meaning. Editorialists, op-eds, and country musicians alike tried to make sense of the tragedy, mourning not only for James but for the state of childhood in America. The city of Chicago, normally seen as bustling and energetic, was instead shown by the media as a community stunned into grief, its parks and playgrounds momentarily subdued. Nationally, parents questioned their own vigilance and lawmakers debated new initiatives to address youth crime and prevention. In the weeks and months that followed, the coverage did not abate. The story spurred documentaries, panel discussions, and countless think pieces. The names of all three boys became etched into the public consciousness as symbols, for better or worse, of innocence lost and the haunting capability for cruelty, even in children. The artistic community responded as well. Poets found sorrowful new language, filmmakers debated the ethics of representation, and playwrights staged pieces meant to grapple with the horror. All of it left a deep imprint. The case became a touchstone in conversations about safety, responsibility, and justice for minors. School assemblies included lessons on stranger danger, city halls fielded angry community meetings, and along the tracks where the tragedy had unfolded, candles and teddy bears became common sights. The press returned to visit the Bulger family regularly, checking on them and using their pain to both elicit sympathy and reinforce the need for change. Decades later, the case remains referenced in criminology textbooks, cited in legislative debates, and invoked every time tragedy befalls another child. The American media's exhaustive and frequently sensational coverage ensured that no detail was left to speculation, that every angle received scrutiny, and that the collective sense of grief and anger was broadcast for all to witness. Through their reporting, the press formed not only the national memory of this awful event, but also served as a mirror, forcing the whole country to reckon with what had taken place, and urging, in the aftermath, a more vigilant and compassionate society. The arrest of Robert Thompson and John Venables, a turning point in the James Bulger case. Following the shocking discovery of James Bulger's body and the intense investigation that consumed Chicago, the arrest of Robert Thompson and John Venables marked a significant and emotional turning point in the case. The gravity of the crime had left a community in turmoil. Everyone was waiting anxiously for answers, and the police were under enormous pressure to bring the perpetrators to justice as swiftly as possible. As evidence mounted and detectives narrowed their focus on the two boys, a new, deeply unsettling wave of realization washed over both law enforcement and the general public. The suspects were not seasoned criminals, but mere children themselves. In the earliest hours after connecting crucial clues, authorities worked meticulously to approach the families of Robert and John. For law enforcement, the process demanded a careful and strategic balance. On one hand, they had to treat the suspects with the rights and considerations accorded to minors. On the other, they were investigating a crime of rare brutality. The detectives involved were seasoned, yet few had ever experienced the chilling combination of violence and youth that this case presented. In the tense living rooms of suburban homes, officers knocked gently but with determination. Both households were initially shocked and bewildered by the police presence, unable or unwilling to comprehend the emerging truth. Robert and John were each separated from their families and brought to the police station. The procedures, though routine in serious criminal investigations, were new territory for everyone involved. There were social workers and legal representatives on hand at every moment, and the presence of parents was strictly managed to maintain objectivity. The boys' reactions were telling, a mix of confusion, denial, fear, and dawning comprehension as the weight of their actions slowly pressed in. Police took care to avoid leading questions during interviews, but it was clear from the outset that the boys were deeply shaken and unable to fully process the enormity of the accusations against them. As detectives began their questioning, the fragile composure of both Robert and John started to crumble. There were moments of sullen silence, erratic outbursts of emotion, and frequent glances toward the door as if holding on to a fragile hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Each boy was questioned separately, a strategy designed to prevent them from constructing a unified story or influencing each other's statements. Initially, both denied any involvement. Their answers were often vague and contradictory, revealing the limitations of their youthful minds when faced with the intricate web of forensic and eyewitness evidence amassed by investigators. It wasn't long before inconsistencies surfaced. Detectives showed patience, gently pressing for details and pointing out contradictions. The mounting pressure eventually pushed John to break first. He began to cry, his denials turning to sobs as he struggled with the reality of the consequences he faced. He hesitated, voice trembling, then haltingly began to recount pieces of what had happened. Robert, maintaining a colder, more distant exterior, resisted longer but could not withstand the mounting factual evidence. As the interview continued, he grew quieter, at times visibly shaking as the truth pressed in from all sides. Eventually both boys confessed, though they minimized their individual roles and blamed each other for much of the violence. The confessions were disturbing not only for their content but for the manner in which they were delivered, sometimes factual, other times disjointed or deflective, as if the full horror of their actions had not yet registered. The detectives, experienced as they were, emerged from these interviews shaken. Their faces betrayed a mix of relief at having caught the killers, and sorrow that such innocence could be so utterly corrupted. News of the arrests spread throughout the city within hours. The community's initial reaction ranged from disbelief to outright outrage. No one could reconcile the image of two ordinary-looking schoolboys, boys who played soccer in the same parks and attended the same schools as their peers, with that of cold-blooded killers. The police, anticipating a high level of public interest and potentially anger, took extra precautions in moving the boys between locations. They shielded Robert and John from the cameras and maintained a guarded presence at the police station, wary of emotional outbursts from others who had been following the case closely. The legal process, too, was fraught with temptation and challenge. Charging minors with such a serious crime required special handling by the judiciary, and both boys were swiftly assigned legal counsel experienced in juvenile law. Their first appearances in court were somber and highly publicized, the small courtroom filled with both reporters and onlookers stunned into silence by the spectacle of two children in handcuffs. The images that emerged from those early proceedings, of two frightened, bewildered boys seated before a judge, became iconic, encapsulating the complex mixture of horror and pity that the case invoked. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered, holding candles and photographs of James Bulger. The atmosphere was tense and emotional, not a call for vengeance, but a collective search for answers and in many cases for compassion in a world suddenly perceived as much darker. Both boys' families faced intense scrutiny and harassment, with reporters and concerned citizens alike camped outside their homes, seeking statements or simply registering their disbelief. The parents of Robert and John, themselves devastated, struggled with their own grief and confusion, thrust into an unforgiving spotlight that threatened to engulf them. As the days and weeks unfolded, every aspect of the arrest became subject to public and legal examination. Public defenders and prosecutors began reviewing mountains of evidence, taped confessions, forensic reports, eyewitness testimonies, and psychological evaluations. Both sides were aware that the trial would be unprecedented, requiring a delicate balance between holding the young perpetrators accountable and acknowledging their youth, immaturity, and possible psychological disturbances. Behind the scenes, the boys' psychological states were examined by teams of doctors and social workers. Robert was often described as closed off, emotionally distant, but capable of sudden outbursts of defensiveness. John, on the other hand, veered between tears, remorse, and difficulty articulating even basic answers to psychologists' questions. Professionals struggled to determine whether these were signs of true comprehension or just the natural panic of children thrust into a nightmare of their own making. During the pre-trial period, issues of competency and culpability loomed large. Could two 10-year-old boys be considered responsible for such a heinous crime? Should they be tried as adults, or would that compound the tragedy? Newspaper columns and TV news reports debated these questions endlessly, with ordinary citizens writing letters to editors and calling into radio shows to voice their opinions. The legal and social debates ignited by the arrest set the tone for everything that followed, forcing the country to re-examine its approach to justice, rehabilitation, and the responsibilities owed to both victims and perpetrators when the perpetrators are children themselves. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued its work with increased scrutiny. The arrest of Robert and John raised difficult questions about prevention and intervention. How could such a crime have occurred without prior warning, and what could communities or authorities have done differently? The police reviewed the boys' backgrounds, uncovering troubled family situations, reports of earlier behavioral incidents at school, and overlooked warning signs that, in hindsight, seemed more significant. The search for why became as intense as the exhaustive hunt for who. Experts in criminology and child psychology were brought in to analyze the case, attending the hearings and providing commentary to the media. Some saw the tragedy as a failure of parental supervision or an indictment of the environment in which the boys were raised. Others warned against oversimplification, arguing that the roots of such violence could extend far beneath the surface, influenced by a web of familial, social, and psychological factors that were not immediately visible. The city of Chicago, meanwhile, began a painful process of reflection and healing. Memorials for James Bulger multiplied across neighborhoods, flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes accumulating at the entrance to the train yard where his body was found. Both grief and confusion pervaded schools, churches, and community centers, with counselors dispatched to help children and adults alike process the enormity of what had happened in their midst. Through it all, Robert and John remained at the center of a swirling storm, alternately vilified and pitied, avoided by other detainees and watched closely by the staff charged with their care. Their days in detention were marked by isolation and unease, meals eaten in silence, restless nights interrupted by nightmares and the constant presence of guards. They wrote letters to their families, sometimes apologetic, sometimes incoherent, reflecting their confusion and fear. Social workers and advocates debated the best approach to their rehabilitation. Some argued for the possibility of redemption, while others insisted that their actions demanded the harshest punishment allowed by law. As the case inched closer to trial, the long shadow cast by the arrests lingered over the city and the nation. The sight of two children accused of such profound evil forced a reckoning far beyond the boundaries of Chicago. It ignited debates about morality, mental health, the power of environment versus individual choice, all seen through the haunted eyes of a community forever altered by what had taken place. The arrests of Robert Thompson and John Venables became much more than a procedural step in a criminal case. They became a symbol of loss, outrage, and the urgent need for society to confront uncomfortable truths about the limits of innocence and the depths of accountability. The heartbreaking story of James Bulger's tragic fate sent shockwaves through the entire United States, leaving a country unsettled and forever changed. From bustling urban centers to the most remote rural communities, parents, teachers, psychologists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens alike found themselves wrestling with a single agonizing question. How could something so unspeakable happen to a child so young? And what did it reveal about American society at large? In the weeks and months that followed the murder, James's name became a somber symbol for the vulnerability of innocence and the unpredictable dangers lurking in even the safest-seeming environments. Media coverage had already saturated the nation, but in homes and schools across the country, the Bulger case became a deeply personal source of anxiety and conversation. Many parents grew even more vigilant, clutching their children's hands a bit tighter while out in public, haunted by a new sense of uncertainty when letting their kids out of sight. People openly questioned whether trust in community had eroded beyond repair. National newspapers published in-depth retrospectives, often featuring black and white photographs of James, bright-eyed, round-cheeked, eternally frozen in a moment of pure childhood, alongside stark images of memorials, police tape, and the bleak rail yard where his life ended. The mood of the nation was one of sorrow but also reflection. Church services were held in cities far removed from Chicago, where worshippers lit candles and prayed for the Bulger family. Support poured in from all over the country. Letters, stuffed animals, poems, and drawings arrived at the Bulger home, each one carrying a message of solidarity or regret that cut across social and cultural divides. Discussions in living rooms, PTA meetings, and school assemblies circled around the theme of lost innocence and the imperative to do more for children's safety. Many parents reported being plagued by nightmares or by a sense of dread that had not existed before. Some communities organized new volunteer patrols to monitor parks and public spaces, while others lobbied for increased police presence around schools. Civic organizations held safety workshops and distributed literature on how to recognize signs of child endangerment, and local government hotlines were flooded with calls from adults seeking advice on how to support children grappling with fear and confusion. The tragedy spurred urgent debate about prevention and accountability, especially regarding the roles of families, schools, and social services. Was it possible to identify warning signs earlier? Had modern American life become too fragmented, too reliant on technology and screens, or too dismissive of behavioral red flags? Experts on juvenile psychology and criminal behavior were interviewed constantly, discussing the developmental complexities that lead a child to commit or fall victim to shocking violence, and how tragedy might be averted in the future. These conversations exposed deep anxieties about gaps in America's social safety net and the sometimes overwhelming pressures placed on working families. For many, the story of James Bulger did not just evoke compassion, it demanded change. All across America, policymakers convened hearings about the adequacy of laws protecting children and penalizing violent juveniles. Some called for harsher punishments, others for increased funding for mental health resources and early intervention. State legislatures discussed mandatory reporting laws and methods to improve the tracking of at-risk youth in the education system. The crime prompted a national re-examination of school counseling programs and parental engagement models, and in some districts the hiring of more social workers and child psychologists. Art and literature responded as well. Writers, poets, and filmmakers grappled with how to capture the overwhelming pain of the loss and the burning questions surrounding innocence, evil, and forgiveness. Classrooms studied the case not through the lens of sensationalism, but as a sobering lesson in empathy, ethics, and civic responsibility. University symposia and academic journals pored over the details, seeking a deeper understanding that might someday translate into prevention. Perhaps most profound was the way the collective mourning persisted long after media attention waned. Each time the anniversary of James's death approached, or whenever a similar tragedy occurred, the Bulger case was invoked as a cautionary tale and a painful testament to the worst possibilities in society. Memorial funds and scholarships were set up in James's name, intended to promote child welfare and support families facing hardship or tragedy. Trees were planted and playgrounds built to honor his memory, turning sorrow into spaces of hope where other children could grow and thrive. Yet amid commemoration, a fundamental discomfort remained. The unresolved trauma of the Bulger case continued to challenge Americans' notions of safety, justice, and the boundaries of childhood. Even decades afterwards, the story lingered in the public psyche, a reminder that a single act of cruelty can ripple out for generations, but also that communities have the power to come together in the aftermath, to reflect, reform, and care more deeply for their young. James's legacy, though born of tragedy, became a call to vigilance and compassion, a legacy that Americans have vowed again and again never to forget.